Tip number 1 is to start with a good reference photo. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it shouldn't be a black blob with no distinguishable features that you can see. But if you do have an expressive reference photo that you'd like to use, you can also use an app like Canva to increase your ability to see its features simply by increasing its contrast. My second tip is something that I like to employ in all of my portrait paintings, which is to use a highlight color to make a light side and a shadow color to make a dark side. In general, we're just emphasizing that the portrait will have a lighter side and a darker side, a highlight side and a shadow side. You can make this happen by using less paint and or a highlight color on the light side and using more paint and or a shadow color on the dark side. For this painting of Lucius, on the light side I used a green for the highlight color, and the dark side I used the black and a purple color. The colors that you use for your light side and your dark side are completely up to you and completely customizable, and that's one thing that I really like about using this method. I've used warm colors for the shadow side and cool colors for the light side and vice versa. Although I do typically use purple a lot for my shadow side and yellow or gold or pink for my light side. But I was really inspired to use this green color in particular for this painting to help emphasize that uneasy look that Lucius had. Now, when we're adding color to black animal portraiture, it can be tempting to use a lot of different colors and make a whole beautiful rainbow out of this black animal. I would in general suggest that limiting or showing a little bit of restraint with your color will produce a more impactful painting. You can set yourself up for success in this way by both limiting the paint colors you have on your actual palette and picking the colors you're going to use for your portrait ahead of time. Tip number 4 applies to almost any painting you would do in watercolor, which is to save your whites. By that, I mean you want the white in your painting to be the white of the paper, not a painted white using white paint or white ink, if you can avoid it. There are some instances where I will use a warm white like buff titanium to add in some opaque details, but in general, you're going to want to save the white using the white of the paper for your portrait. I would also add alongside of that is to not be afraid to save a lot of white. My portraits typically, especially on the light side, are a lot of paper showing through and not too much paint. This in general makes paintings more interesting because the viewer kind of has to fill in the details for themselves, and that makes people look at your art longer and in general just makes it more fun and interesting. Have you ever noticed that when you're maybe halfway through a painting and you've done the basic features like the eyes or the ears or the mouth or the nose, you're like, wow, this is looking really good, really interesting. I'm loving the contrast. But then by the time you finish it, it's lost some of that pop. That's because we've overworked it and now we don't have any room for interpretation. We've also likely lost some of that beautiful contrast of the dark darks and the light lights. So sometimes less is more when it comes to paint. More paper can be a very good thing. And my final tip for you today is a very practical tip. I used to use the color called Payne's Gray to be the darkest dark in all of my paintings. I just really liked it, and up until that point I hadn't had success using other blacks. But unfortunately over time I was noticing that my paintings were becoming kind of green, and I realized that that was because Payne's Gray is a blue black. So whenever I would mix that black or try to make my yellows or my oranges or my browns darker by mixing them with Payne's Gray, it would have this greenish hint to it. And I didn't want that. So I looked at the pigment codes and I found another black that is just a single pigment. It's called Neutral Tint. It's an American Journey brand paint, and I love it. Now I don't have any issues mixing that black color with my oranges, my yellows, my browns, and getting green. It stays a very clean black no matter what color you mix it with. And I also like that it kind of is just black. I really like the color gray, and I don't think gray needs to be necessarily blue, especially when I'm going for warmth with my portraits. So when you do a watery mix of neutral tint, you'll get a nice clean gray color that just looks really nice. And I would also say that you do not need to be afraid of going too dark. In the darkest areas of your paintings, you want to go all in and make it dark. And then that will help with the whole concept of contrast and really make your paintings pop. Just remember that the darkest darks should be in areas where you want your viewer to focus, especially where the darkest darks meet the lightest lights, because that will be where the viewer's eye is drawn to. I hope these tips will help you succeed when you're painting black animals. If you're curious about that neutral tint paint color or any of the other supplies that I love to use, just visit paint333.com for your free supply list. Let's paint!